Right. So one of the things that's going to plague Western Europe is repeated invasions. We're going to see many different invaders push into Western Europe. We're going to see the Muslims who raided from the Mediterranean. We're going to see a nomadic group called the Magyars who are going to invade from the east. But by far the worst and the most troublesome of these invasions were the Vikings. And so the Vikings originated in Scandinavia, and they began to use the rivers throughout Europe and Russia to travel inland. And they could use their longships, which sat very shallow in the water, to travel up these rivers. They could attack establishments and they could be gone before anybody could really do anything to stop them. And so they were by far the most troublesome of all these invaders. And you can see on the map here all these different invaders that were plaguing Western Europe. And so it's this situation, trying to deal with these invasions, that's ultimately going to lead to the rise of smaller regional states and ultimately feudalism in Western Europe. And so unlike Eastern Europe, where we saw the Byzantine Empire kind of maintain control, we're going to see smaller regional states develop. And so in England, we're going to have a small Celtic and Germanic kingdoms that begin to form, and they're going to spend a lot of the early Middle Ages fighting off Viking invasions. In Germany, we're going to see, after the fall of the Carolingian Empire, those local counts and lords kind of become their own leaders in small regional states. In France, similarly, we're going to see counts and other nobles become local lords and impose their authority. We're even going to see groups of Vikings who are going to settle in northern France. And then in Spain, most of Spain was still under the control of that Caliphate of Cordoba, the Islamic Caliphate there. But there were still Christian states in the northern parts of Spain that continued to try to fight off the Muslims. And then Italy was mostly made up of many small city-states and many small regional kingdoms. But there was really no centralized rule left in Western Europe. And so what we see develop in Western Europe is a feudal system. And so feudalism, and this is a very simplified way of looking at feudalism, but basically it starts at the top with the king. And in essence, the king owns all of the land. But the king was having trouble defending all of that territory because of all these invasions. And so he needed soldiers. And so to make it easier to oversee this vast territory, the king is going to appoint nobles or vassals to fiefs. And each of these lords is going to receive his own fief in exchange for loyalty to this king. And these vassals then were in charge of their fiefs. And so their main responsibility was to protect that territory. And so to protect that territory, you needed military service. And so to provide military service, similar to what we're going to see in Japan with the samurai, we have a military class of knights. And so knights received even smaller fiefs in exchange for military service. And so the basic bonds of feudalism was an exchange of land in return for loyalty. Now, in actuality, it was much more complicated than this. You had competing alliances and competing loyalties. But this is a basic feudal structure. And so feudalism was the political system that dominated Western Europe in the Middle Ages. Manorialism is the economic system that dominates Western Europe in the Middle Ages. And so the manor refers to the noble's estate, right? And so it usually included a central, sometimes fortified house, if you will, castle, and the surrounding land and territory. And so now that the noble has this large fief that he has to keep track of, he needed workers. And so serfs are going to provide labor. And so serfs, they weren't free, as a free peasant would be, but they also weren't slaves. You couldn't buy and sell serfs. Serfs were bound to the land. And so if that land changed hands, typically the serf stayed with that land. And the serf provided labor in exchange for protection. And so part of what the serf produced every year went to the owner of the land, went to that noble. And so the serf provided labor in exchange for protection. And typically the serf also had a house, and as long as they worked on the land, they were provided a house and kind of basic necessities. So even though it wasn't ideal, at least their basic needs were met. Another feature of manorialism is that for the most part, these manors were self-sufficient. Everything they needed, they produced. And so typically there was a village within that manor, and they grew all their crops in the surrounding fields, and they could produce everything they needed right there in the manor. And because of that, these manors were, for the most part, self-sufficient.